All right, let's continue with ecology, talking about biomes. So biomes are a type of environment, and we expect to find similar types of plants and animals in them, and similar environmental conditions such as rainfall and temperature. But those plants and animals might not be closely related. They just have similar adaptations. So here's some of the biomes that we're going to talk about in detail. Tropical forest, savanna, deserts, chaparral, temperate grassland, temperate broadleaf forests, northern coniferous forest, also called boreal forest, and tundra. So the two factors that are most important in what kind of biome we're going to have is annual precipitation and temperature. So trees especially require a significant amount of rainfall. So environments that have a low amount of precipitation, whether they are hot, moderate, or cold, aren't going to have trees because they simply don't have enough rain. Areas that are very cold, even if they have a lot of rainfall, are going to have different species than moderate or warm areas that also have a lot of rainfall. We expect to find similar adaptations, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the plants and the animal sections in modules 2 and 3. For example, here's two examples of cactus that are from opposite sides of the world. They look very similar, but they actually evolved their leafless, fat-stemmed. All right, I'm back. So this process is called convergent evolution, which we'll hear more about as the semester goes on. So these two plants are not very closely related. They evolve these characteristics independently in different places, but and that's one of the things that we often see with similar biomes. Even though the environment is very similar, very dry, and so that leads to adaptations to reduce water loss, like having reduced or no leaves, and having a fat stem that can store water, and having a waxy coating to slow evaporation. So terrestrial biomes, we already talked about the difference that we find between biomes of temperature and precipitation, and precipitation, rain or snow or whatever. And there's also differences in seasonality of rain. Is there continuous rain, or is there a wet season and a dry season? And wind can also play a big difference. High winds will limit or eliminate the ability for trees to be tall, for example. So the wettest, warmest environment would be a tropical forest. And so everything we're going to talk about after this is either not as wet or not as warm as a tropical forest. So this is also the most productive ecosystem in terms of carbon fixation and total biomass, and also species diversity. Tropical forests are where we find all of those things at the highest level. So tropical means relatively close to the equator. So we're only going to find tropical forest on either side of the equator, north and south of the equator, before we get to that 30 degrees latitude north and south. There's tropical rainforests, which tend to get almost daily rain, and then there's tropical dry forests, which often have a wet season and a dry season, but still enough precipitation for there to be trees. So here's the distribution of tropical forests, and you can see this blue line is the equator, where we have the most intense sunlight. So tropical forests tend to be around there. And so any place that you have a lot of trees, you can just assume that there's a significant amount of annual rainfall. So deserts have low rain, and they, as we already talked about, they tend to occur close to the 30 degrees north latitude and 30 degrees south latitude. Although, you know, there's some exceptions to that, as we talked about already. So low precipitation, less than 30 centimeters a year, generally. Some get almost no precipitation. They're the driest deserts on Earth. Like, I think the Namib Desert in South Africa is the driest desert on Earth. It can go 4 or 5 years without any precipitation at all. But it can be variable as well. Deserts can have relatively wet years and very dry years that can last for a decade or more. We expect to find similar adaptations, adaptations for heat, adaptations for resistance to water loss, adaptations in plants like reduced or no leaves. Many animals become nocturnal when it's cooler, and they hide during the day to reduce overheating and water loss. Camels that I have pictured here, which have several adaptations. They have adaptations in their kidneys for reduced water loss. They produce very little urine, and so they don't need to drink as much water. And they also store their body fat in a weird way. So camels have a hump. I was told when I was a kid that hump was full of water. That's actually not true. It's full of fat. So they can store a large amount of fat, so they can go long time without eating. They can go weeks without eating. And because the fat is all in a hump, that reduces it increases their ability to lose heat to the environment. They have the long, skinny legs that they can lose heat from. So here's Arizona desert, which if you've never been to this American Southwest and visited the desert, I highly recommend it. It's a very different kind of environment, and especially if you don't go there during the hottest part of the year, but if you go there especially in the spring, it's really incredible, and lots of flowering plants that are, if you didn't grow up in a desert environment, are very weird. So we can see the desert distribution here, close to 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south is where we find the most deserts. And that's because of those Hadley cells, the way the falling air from in those circulating air cells tends to fall at around 30 degrees. And again, we don't have a desert in the southeastern United States because of the Gulf of Mexico, because of weather systems that move north from the Gulf of Mexico, tend to bring rain there. Savannah, think of Savannah as hot grassland. So the fact that there's hardly any trees on the Savannah means that they have less rain. So trees mean rain. So when you have a biome that has hardly any or no trees, it's probably pretty dry. And that's what the savanna is. So savanna is the only reason savanna is not desert is because they have seasonal rain. So savannas are in close to the equator, tropical, but have highly seasonal rain. So during the wet season, which might only last for 2 months or 3 months, there's a lot of rain, and that's enough for the plants that are adapted to living there to survive for up to 10 months with no rain whatsoever. And they tend to be fairly hot. Large herbivores tend to dominate because there's a lot of grass. Grass is food for large herbivores, and also insects. Insects by biomass are the dominant herbivores in savanna. Their fires are common, and this is one of the biomes where fires are a normal part of the ecosystem. So humans can cause the fires, but there are lightning-caused fires as well that are part of the ecosystems, and the plants there are not harmed by fire. In fact, there are some plants whose seeds only sprout after they've been scorched. So here's the distribution of savanna, and you can see that it's quite close to the equator. So more rain than a desert, not enough rain to be a forest. Chaparral is also called the Mediterranean climate because it's the climate that's found all around the Mediterranean Sea, but we also find it in places like California. So chaparral is dry and has a seasonal wet and dry season. So it tends to be, it can be warm or moderate, so not as hot as Savannah, more moderate and very seasonal rainfall. So you can have 4 or 5 months with no rain at all. And so there are trees, but they tend to be small, scrubby trees, and there tends to be a lot of short grasses and other types of small plants in between all of the trees. So you don't get a dense tree coverage. There's a wide variety of species, not as many as you would find in a tropical forest, like a tropical dry forest, but still more diversity of plants and animals than you would find in a desert. Chaparral is desirable as farmland. However, most crops, I should say, require irrigation if they're being grown in a chaparral biome. Like in California, most crops are being irrigated in some way with extra water. And we'll talk about some of the biomes that are used for farming that don't require irrigation. For example, if you clear tropical rainforest and put in a papaya plantation or banana plantation, no extra water is required. There's no irrigation. The crop is completely watered by rain. So here's where we find chaparral. So you can see that it's outside of this tropical zone and actually near desert areas. So this is the Mediterranean Sea, if you don't know California. Also southern Australia, South Africa are chaparral. So there are trees and bushes and woody plants, but they tend to be small and distantly separated from each other. Sometimes we call that a scrubby forest. Temperate grassland is sort of like savanna, but cooler. So temperate grassland we would call here in the United States, we call prairie. So we have tall grass prairie and short grass prairie. Tall grass prairie is found in areas that have more rain. So tall grass prairie you would find in areas that are almost have enough rain for forest, but not quite. And that's what Illinois used to be. Illinois, before the settlers came and started clearing everything, Illinois was about half tall grass prairie and half forest. So we're right on the border of having enough rain for forest with tall grass prairie. If you go further west, like Kansas, Oklahoma, that was short grass prairie, which means a little bit less rain. So that's kind of the edge for farmability without irrigation. Anything that gets less rain than prairie is not going to have enough rain for farming, and you're going to have to irrigate. And there's still irrigation used in some areas today that were short grass prairie, like Oklahoma and Kansas. They're on the western half of those states, and like West Texas, South Dakota. Some of those farms, depending on the crop, do use irrigation from groundwater. Fire is also a natural part of prairie and temperate grassland ecosystem. The naturally occurring plants that are found in these ecosystems aren't harmed at all. They're perennial plants with deep roots that will just grow right back the next year. Native Americans used to set fire to prairie as well to encourage that new plant growth, which they knew was good for attracting bison. So just like in the savanna, where grasses are the dominant plant, the same thing is true on the prairie, where also grasses are the dominant plant, different species than you find in the savanna. We have large herbivores like bison are the dominant animals that you find in these places. Grassland temperate grassland is the most desirable farmland in the world. So most of it is gone and has been converted to farmland. In the US, tall grass prairie is the most desirable farmland because you don't have to clear trees because there are hardly any trees, and it gets enough rain for the most popular crops like wheat and barley and corn. You don't need to water. Tall grass prairie gets enough rain to grow those crops. So 95% of the tall grass prairie has been turned into farmland and is gone. Tall grass prairie is really incredibly beautiful in the spring when all the plants start to come up and bloom. We have a restored tall grass prairie on campus just to the south side of the Health Sciences building, and hopefully we will get to take a little walk out there later in the semester. Because by April and May, that's like peak season for blooming flowers on the tall grass prairie. So we'll take a walk out there. You can on your own as well. The restored prairie that's behind the building there has little walking paths through it, and it's open. You can walk through there. One of the things that makes prairie such fantastic farmland is that the topsoil is very deep. The topsoil can be 6 to 10 meters deep, which is the deepest topsoil that you find anywhere in the world. And temperate grasslands in Eurasia would be the same way. So the problem is, though, if you farm it, that soil starts to be depleted and eroded, and we'll talk about a little bit about soil erosion in a subsequent chapter. So this is similar to shortgrass prairie that's found in Mongolia. Sometimes areas are drier because of elevation, and that's the case in Mongolia. Pretty much the entire country is at a higher elevation, and that means less rain because as air mass gets moved up the side of a mountain, it cools. Cool air can't hold as much moisture, and it rains. And so then as those air systems pass over the top of these flat, high elevation plateaus, there's less moisture. So you get a lot of grass. Northern Coniferous Forest, this is the largest biome on Earth in terms of total land mass, but it's also one of the least useful for humans if you're interested in human use of the land. It's terrible for farmland because it's too cold. You can grow trees there, so the primary use to humans of boreal forest is timber. And this is one of the least inhabited and largest untouched areas of forest on Earth is northern boreal forest, which extends over great areas of Alaska and Canada, and also Siberia and Scandinavia. They tend to have much fewer species. So as the temperature gets colder and colder and colder for biomes, you have less species diversity. So as you go farther and farther away from the equator, the species diversity is less. So we tend to have these large forests that are dominated by just a few species, just a handful of species, instead of like in a tropical rainforest, you might have over 1,000 species of just trees. And in a boreal forest, you might have 5 to 10 species of trees. And you might find huge stands of trees where you have 10,000 trees that are all a single species, really close together. And when they do genetic studies on these trees, they find that they're actually clones of a single individual that grew up from root shoots. So low diversity. Even though they're over a huge area, there can be a lot of animals, but also less diversity. So fewer species, even though they might be in huge numbers in those areas. And there might be a lot of migratory residents, so birds that only come there in the summer for breeding season. large areas of the forest can be killed occasionally by fires. Fire is not a natural part of this ecosystem. They do occur, and when they do, it can result in a slow rebound of the ecosystem. Insect outbreaks can also kill large areas if there's a really warm summer and followed by a warm winter, and insects aren't killed over the winter. There can be a large die-off, like from pine beetles are one of the culprits for that, which is one of the things people are worried about with global warming, is that there's going to be problems with boreal forest because of insects not being killed if the winters aren't cold enough. This is where we find the most old growth as well. So an old growth forest has not been logged, and there's very little old growth forest left in temperate areas. They've almost all been completely logged out. So boreal forest is one place where you can still find really untouched wilderness. So this is where we find boreal forest across the northern part of the continents, and there's no boreal forest in the southern hemisphere, although there used to be in Antarctica, but it's too cold now to have there are a few plants that live on the fringes here in Antarctica, but I think moss is about the only plant that lives there, but there's no trees at all. Temperate broadleaf forest, this is what we would also call a deciduous forest. Temperate broadleaf forest is a more inclusive term, however, because there are some forest trees that are evergreen trees that are not deciduous. So a deciduous tree means that it loses its leaves in the winter. So if something is called an evergreen, or sometimes they call them a live version of that tree, like live oak, that means that it doesn't drop its leaves in the winter. It's the same thing as an evergreen. So this is the other biome that is present in Illinois, and temperate broadleaf forest it covers the entire eastern seaboard of the United States from Maine down to Georgia. Was temperate broadleaf forest, and so it tends to be highly seasonal, although there tends to be, because trees need rain, it tends to have rain or snow pretty much all year round. There's no like dry season, wet season. So trees really change a biome, because once you have trees, once you have a continuous canopy of trees, the canopy of the trees is its own environment, and you have a different community of animals and even some epiphytic plants, which we'll talk about, that can live in that canopy. And then you have the forest floor community of organisms, and then you have the soil community of organisms. So a forest really has layers of different communities of species, and we'll talk more about that in a later chapter. So in Illinois, our forest is dominated by deciduous trees, although there are a few types of evergreen trees like Douglas fir that you'll find in Illinois. In the southern hemisphere, like in Australia, eucalyptus, which is an evergreen tree, is one of the dominant trees in their temperate forests. So if you see eucalyptus trees here, they're imported exotics. They're not native. There's no eucalyptus trees native to North America. Although they're very popular as ornamental trees in California. They can't live here in Illinois, though, I don't think. So forests are the major resource of forested areas is, of course, timber. They are less popular to turn into farmland, although forested areas have been extensively turned into farmland because, of course, there's a lot of rain. Rain is good for farming. But the problem is these were less desirable for early settlers for farming because you have to clear the trees before you can farm. But it's still done. There's a lot of farms. So if you go east of Illinois, any farms you see are where forest used to be. The forest was cleared to make pasture for animals and to make and for farms. for humans. And pretty much all of the forest east of the Rocky Mountains, which the Rocky Mountains are in the western United States, they go through Colorado and um, Wyoming. So everything east of there in the United States has been completely logged at least once. Every single tree was cut down one time in the last 200 years. And so all of the forests that you see now in the Smoky Mountains and in the eastern United States, the Appalachians, it's all secondary growth. It's all regrown after being completely logged at least one time. The only old growth forest in the United States is in, of course, Alaska. There's a lot of untouched old growth forest but it's boreal forest. And on the West Coast, there are some patches of never logged old growth forest in Washington, Oregon, and California, which are really incredible. If you ever get a chance to go on vacation and visit an old growth forest that has never been logged, it's different than the forest that we're used to here in the eastern United States. There's fewer plants in the understory. It's very quiet in an old growth forest. It's different. So I encourage you to go visit old growth forest if you get a chance. Here's a nice picture of forest. So if you have continuous tree canopy here, that's a forest. If there's large spaces in between the trees, like you see in Chaparral or in Savannah biome, where you might have a few trees, that is not a forest. Forest means you have a continuous tree canopy. If a squirrel could go a mile without touching the ground by jumping from tree to tree, that's a forest. So you can see the entire eastern United States is the right environment for broadleaf forest, and was continuous forest 400 years ago. None of it was cleared until then. Most of Europe, Eastern Asia here, Eastern China, Japan was all, and this is part of Russia here. This actually is part of Russia. Was also broadleaf forest. And I say was because a lot of it has been logged. So there might still be a lot of forest there in patches. Tundra is too cold for trees. It might have significant annual precipitation, but it's too cold for trees. So trees, if you have trees, you have to have enough rain and it can't be too cold for trees. So tundra is too cold for trees. And there also tends to be permafrost. So tundra is close to the Arctic Circle. And again, because it's cold, it's colder than boreal forest. We have even fewer species. So there are grasses, mosses, even some small shrubs, and maybe some small scrubby trees, lichens. So permafrost limits plant growth. And permafrost means that a layer of soil below a certain level, maybe 8 to 12 inches below the surface, doesn't melt even in the summer. It's frozen solid. And permafrost melting is one of the things that's of concern with global warming, because permafrost, when it melts, releases methane, which is bad for global warming. Methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2, and that's one of the things that is concerning to climate scientists, is that if there's a sudden melting of a large amount of permafrost, there's going to be a huge bump in the amount of methane in the atmosphere, and that's going to create a positive feedback loop where it gets even warmer, and then more permafrost melts, and that releases more methane, and then it gets warmer. So, food for thought. So there can be large amounts of herbivores like caribou, reindeer, predatory species. But again, the total number of species is going to be less. So the further north we go, the colder it gets, the fewer species total there are going to be. Fewer plant species, fewer animal species, even though some of those species might be in great abundance where they occur. Very little human settlement. Most of the settlement in tundra is crowded around water, like near the sea, or more recently is where there are oil or tin mines or something, coal mines, something that's being extracted. And the summers are very, very short. We can see here where tundra is. Now, you don't notice there's no tundra in Antarctica because it's too cold. There's no place in Antarctica that qualifies as tundra. Very sparse human habitation, but also very untouched. Extremely short growing season. The summer might only last 8 weeks. So that's a very short season, but many birds, migratory birds, take advantage of this, and the tundra is host to many migratory birds that come for the abundant insects in the summer to nest and raise their babies. We're going to skip the aquatic biomes in chapter 52 just for time's sake. So that is the end of biomes, and populations are next.